The late 1970s and early 1980s were a time of technological maximalism in the American military-industrial complex. Following the initial successes of the space race and the deployment of satellite reconnaissance systems, the U.S. High Command became obsessed with achieving not merely parity, but absolute, unassailable dominance across every domain of warfare: land, sea, air, and, increasingly, space. The need was framed as existential. The existing U.S. military communication and surveillance network was a patchwork of aging, incompatible systems, analog radio, insecure microwave links, and early-generation satellites vulnerable to jamming. If the balloon went up and a global conflict erupted, NATO command could easily be deafened and blinded within the opening hours. Out of this strategic anxiety, one project was born, conceived on a scale of ambition and secrecy rarely seen even during the peak of the Cold War. It was known by the codename Project Sentinel, not its real name, which remains highly classified, and it was launched as one of the most ambitious and expensive technology projects in U.S. history. The veil of secrecy. The sheer scope and vulnerability of Sentinel demanded absolute secrecy. It was a classified program so big and so secret that even members of Congress weren't told its real goals. Funding was buried deep within multiple departmental budgets, spread across the Air Force, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, often disguised as appropriations for next-generation weather modeling, or secure long-distance telephony research. Only the Sentinel Executive Committee, a rotating group of 36 officials from the Pentagon and the White House, knew the full integration plan. The secrecy was necessary because the very existence of the system, a fully integrated global command and control network, would instantly become the #1 priority target for Soviet nuclear attack. The promise of omniscience. The operational promise of Sentinel was nothing less than the creation of a seamless, global digital consciousness for the U.S. military. The network was envisioned as a revolutionary surveillance and communication backbone that would integrate all intelligence streams, from reconnaissance satellites fast attack submarines, and airborne warning and control systems AWACS into a single, real-time command picture. Provide unbreakable, high-bandwidth communication between the President, the Pentagon, and every forward-deployed unit, regardless of their location on Earth or in orbit. Utilize groundbreaking frequency-hopping spread spectrum (FHSS) technology, a new method of rapidly changing radio frequencies, to ensure communications could not be jammed or intercepted by the Soviets. It would give the U.S. absolute dominance by allowing commanders to see everything, talk to everyone, and react instantly to any global threat. It was the future of warfare, the perfect marriage of technology and strategy. But soon, the Pentagon realized something terrifying. The scale of the ambition far outstripped the state of 1980s technology. The complexity of the integrated systems was overwhelming. The project didn't work, and worse, it wasn't just wasting money. It was teaching the Soviets exactly how to catch up. By the early 1980s, Project Sentinel had spiraled out of control. Its scope had expanded, its deadlines had been missed, and the initial, optimistic price tag had ballooned into a $6 billion monster, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to nearly $25 billion in today's currency. This exponential cost increase was a clear indicator of fundamental, unresolved engineering problems. The system was riddled with what engineers euphemistically called integration challenges. Systems wouldn't sync. The core challenge was synchronizing data flow between hardware built by a dozen different defense contractors. The ground-based processors used different clock speeds and operating protocols than the airborne relay units and the satellites. The result was a digital stutter. Data packets were corrupted, command signals were delayed, and the real-time intelligence picture was often minutes or even hours out of date. Satellites couldn't handle the load. The newly launched geostationary and low Earth orbit satellites, intended to be the high-bandwidth nerve center of the network, proved incapable of handling the sheer volume of data mandated by the project goals. They would become overwhelmed, forcing them to arbitrarily drop transmissions or enter emergency, low-power modes. Ground stations overheated and shut down. The immense power requirements of the advanced transmitting equipment housed in the forward operating ground stations caused constant issues. The cooling systems were inadequate, leading to frequent, uncommanded thermal shutdowns. Engineers joked that Sentinel was too advanced to function. The threat of radio leakage. These technical failures were frustrating and embarrassing, but the biggest threat wasn't technical failure, it was radio leakage, a catastrophic byproduct of the system's attempts to function. The core communication method of Sentinel was the highly sensitive frequency hopping spread spectrum (FHSS) technology. FHSS works by having the transmitter and receiver agree on a rapid, pre-programmed sequence of frequency changes, making the transmission appear to an outsider as nothing but random noise across the spectrum. If executed perfectly, it is virtually unjammable and unbreakable. But the Sentinel system was not executing perfectly. Every malfunctioning component was struggling to maintain the synchronization needed for FHSS. When the systems failed to sync, or when they overheated, they didn't just shut down. They experienced a momentary, catastrophic, desynchronization event. During these events, the transmitters, desperate to find the correct frequency, would momentarily pause their hopping pattern or even broadcast a continuous, highly characteristic, acquisition signal across a wide bandwidth. This signal was intended for internal system use, a digital handshake, but its unique, complex mathematical structure was being unintentionally broadcast into the air. This meant that every time a component of the $6 billion network failed, it was unintentionally broadcasting highly advanced U.S. communication patterns and key synchronization identifiers into the air. And the Soviets, with their own vast network of ground-based listening posts and surveillance trawlers, the SIGINT signals intelligence apparatus, were recording every single failure. For the Soviet Union, Project Sentinel's existence was confirmation of their deepest fears about U.S. technological superiority. They poured enormous resources into listening posts near U.S. bases, in Cuba, on the Kamchatka Peninsula, and on specialized AGI, Auxiliary General Intelligence, trawlers positioned along international waters, all with the single mandate of intercepting or jamming the rumored new U.S. network. The Soviet SIGINT crews expected silence or impenetrable noise. They expected a wall of encryption they couldn't bypass. What they got was infinitely better. A step-by-step, real-time tutorial on how the future of military communication worked. Learning from failure. When a Sentinel ground station near the Mediterranean shut down due to overheating, the Soviet trawler station nearby logged the telltale acquisition signal, a complex, unique sequence of digital pulses the U.S. system used to find its satellites. When a satellite struggled to maintain its data load, it broadcasted error correction patterns that the Soviets quickly recognized as being related to the synchronization keys. This intelligence stream became known internally to the KGB and GRU, Soviet military intelligence, as Project Lighthouse, because the flawed U.S. network was inadvertently shining a bright, periodic beacon into the darkness. The key to FHSS. The Soviets realized they didn't need to break the final encryption key, they needed to understand the hopping pattern algorithm. The Sentinel failures provided precisely the necessary data points. Each desynchronization event was a momentary window into the system's inner workings. A master key. The Soviet analysts, utilizing sophisticated digital processing capabilities, began to assemble these fragmented, acquisition signals, into a comprehensive understanding of the U.S. system's operating architecture. They weren't just learning how to intercept FHSS, they were learning how to build their own reliable version of it, and, more critically, how to identify and exploit the structural weaknesses inherent in the U.S. design. The irony was crushing. The $6 billion investment the U.S. made to ensure absolute dominance was inadvertently accelerating Soviet technological development by bypassing decades of costly, trial-and-error research. The U.S. was using its failures to educate its adversary. The realization of the scale of the failure, both technical and intelligence-based, did not come easily to the Pentagon. Internal reports were initially dismissed as alarmist or based on insufficient data. It wasn't until a high-level, interagency task force analyzed the intelligence gained from NATO's own SIGINT operations, coincidentally observing the Soviet reaction to the Sentinel emissions, that the true scope of the disaster became clear. The Soviet military was demonstrably ahead of schedule in deploying its own secure communications architecture, and the patterns they were using bore an uncanny, specific resemblance to the unique error signatures of Project Sentinel. For Pentagon planners, this was the ultimate betrayal. Not only had the project failed to deliver on its promise of absolute dominance, but it had actively compromised U.S. strategic security. The decision was made, quietly, in the mid-1980s, Project Sentinel was to be dismantled. The final cost estimate of the program stood at nearly $6 billion. The program was cancelled, but the failure was meticulously covered up. The official story, the official public justification was that the project was technologically overambitious for its time, and had been integrated into smaller, more manageable programs. There was no mention of the catastrophic radio leakage or the intelligence bonanza handed to the Soviets. The classified truth, the full intelligence failure, the extent of the Soviet lighthouse coup, and the specific data that had been compromised were classified under a security level equivalent to the nuclear launch codes. The engineers and intelligence analysts who blew the whistle were silenced, their reports buried or discredited. America's $6 billion failure, Project Sentinel, became a silent, painful reminder that in the high-stakes game of the Cold War, the greatest threats were sometimes not the enemy's strength, but the unintended consequences of one's own weakness. The dream of absolute dominance collapsed under the weight of its own complexity, inadvertently giving the USSR a technological shortcut that shortened the electronic gap between the two superpowers, fundamentally altering the calculus of the modern battlefield. In the silent, subterranean electronic intelligence labs scattered across the Soviet Union, from the desolate, wind-swept listening post towers near the Norwegian border to the advanced analysis centers buried deep within Moscow and Novosibirsk, a profound sense of disbelief gave way to feverish, almost hysterical activity. The analysts of the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, responsible for encryption and communications security, and the GRU's main intelligence directorate, Signals Intelligence (SIGINT) section were military professionals trained in the brutal, slow-burn art of electronic warfare. They were accustomed to the painstaking labor of the Cold War, hours spent sifting through static, noise, and complex Soviet-built jamming efforts to glean a single, minute piece of actionable intelligence. They expected a wall of impenetrable noise, a challenge that required decades of cryptanalysis and technological countermeasures. They were resigned to being perpetually behind the technologically superior Americans. But suddenly, in a moment of technological hubris and spectacular failure, the US had stopped fighting fair. The Americans had, through a grotesque act of technological self-sabotage, thrown open the laboratory doors. The KGB's SIGINT teams, monitoring the global bandwidth, began logging signals that defied all expectation. The chaotic, powerful emissions from the malfunctioning Project Sentinel network were not merely noise, they were high-volume, highly structured error signals. Soviet intelligence analysts were stunned. They knew the rules of the game. They weren't supposed to be hearing this, not in the clear, not with such frequency and clarity, and certainly not with such an intimate view of the system's inner workings. They weren't supposed to see data structures and communication architectures decades ahead of what they could build with their own constrained microelectronics and budget. But suddenly, Moscow had an unprecedented, high-definition look into the future of U.S. military command and control. The intelligence coup was breathtaking. The digital spoils of failure. The intelligence flowed in, channeled through priority lines to the central analysis labs. The sheer quality of the compromised data surpassed any previous espionage success. The Americans had not simply failed, they had failed in a uniquely informative way. Samples of next-generation American modulation techniques. The analysts immediately recognized the sophistication of the digital encoding methods used by Sentinel when its systems attempted recovery from failure. These advanced modulation techniques, methods like phase shift keying (PSK) and quadrature amplitude modulation (QAM), used at high rates, maximized data transfer over narrow bandwidths. By watching the error correction sequences, the Soviets gained the core algorithms, allowing them to leapfrog years of internal development focused on inefficient analog systems. Early forms of frequency hopping (FHSS) signatures. This was the crown jewel. The U.S. system was designed to jump between thousands of frequencies in a pre-programmed sequence, the frequency hopping spread spectrum (FHSS). When a Sentinel satellite or ground station lost synchronization, it briefly broadcast the precise mathematical key, the digital handshake, used to define the hopping sequence. This exposed the genetic code of the FHSS algorithm. The Soviet intelligence report on this specific discovery noted that understanding the error signature was effectively the key to building the fix, and thus, the system itself. Encryption schemas never intended for enemy ears. While the cryptographic core of the messages remained unbreakable, the system's failure modes revealed the structure of the encryption envelopes, the size of the data blocks, the cycling sequence of the keys, and the protocols for message initialization and termination. This structural knowledge alone saved the KGB years of brute force cryptanalysis, providing the framework needed to build effective countermeasures against future American systems. Timing signatures of U.S. command and control relays. The constant efforts by the ground stations to reacquire their satellites provided precise data on the timing, latency, and geographic routing of the U.S. military's most critical command relays. The Soviets now knew exactly where the U.S. expected their secure command signals to travel, exposing critical choke points and relay nodes that were supposed to be invisible. They learned the operational rhythm of the U.S. strategic backbone. This intelligence stream became known internally to the KGB and grew as Project Lighthouse, because the flawed U.S. network was inadvertently shining a bright, periodic beacon into the darkness of Soviet technological isolation. The chief analyst for the GRU's Signals Division, a man known only as Colonel Dmitry, reportedly summarized the situation in a closed meeting. "We have been gifted the entire final exam before the course has started. Our problem is no longer design, our problem is production." And the crowning, humiliating irony that the Soviets delighted in. The Soviets didn't steal it. They didn't deploy a single agent, risk a submarine, or crack a single code. America accidentally handed it to them. The $6 billion intended to secure U.S. dominance had become a massive, self-sabotaging electronic broadcasting station for the Soviet Union. With the Project Lighthouse data flowing in, a continuous, real-time feed of American technological distress, the Soviet military-industrial complex was galvanized into action. The data was immediately channeled into a series of highly prioritized, top-secret programs focused on rapid technological adaptation. This was not the slow, painstaking process of classical espionage. It was an unprecedented reverse engineering race based on a free, unsolicited blueprint. By the mid-80s, the Soviet engineers, traditionally hampered by long, bureaucratic development cycles and a systemic inability to produce microchips as sophisticated as their Western counterparts, had begun integrating parts of the leaked American designs into their own prototypes. Their goal was not the impossible task of replicating the full, complex Sentinel system. They lacked the computing power and the resources for that. Their goal was simpler, yet strategically decisive: to identify the core, fundamental breakthroughs in the U.S. design and adapt them to their existing, aging platforms. The data allowed Soviet engineers to skip years of costly research, eliminate dead-end technological pathways, and bypass the immense capital investment required for basic research. They were given the solution to problems they hadn't even finished defining yet. While the U.S. struggled with a malfunctioning mega-project, trying to justify its costs and fix its systemic flaws, the Soviets were busy weaponizing the information. The advancements appeared rapidly, silently, and strategically, significantly bolstering the combat effectiveness of key Soviet assets. Air defense data links. Soviet surface-to-air missile (SAM) networks, which had long suffered from slow, noise-prone analog data links between radar stations and missile batteries, were quietly upgraded using the improved modulation techniques learned from Sentinel's errors. This resulted in faster, more reliable data transfer for targeting, making their massive air defense grid significantly more lethal to NATO aircraft. Submarine communication systems. The most vital application was in the strategic fleet. Submarine communications, notoriously difficult due to the physics of water, were upgraded using the principles of FHSS gained from the leaks. This allowed Soviet ballistic missile submarines to maintain more reliable, secure communication with command without needing to surface or use vulnerable long-wire antennae for extended periods. This increased the time they could spend hidden in the deep, significantly enhancing the viability of the Soviet nuclear deterrent. Early warning networks. The vast, rigid Soviet early warning radar network was enhanced to handle the new, high-volume data streams, allowing the command centers to process the initial stages of a potential NATO attack faster and with less internal confusion. This reduced the reaction time and, potentially, the chance of a catastrophic accidental launch due to confusion. Encryption suites used by long-range bombers. The structural knowledge gained about U.S. encryption envelopes allowed the Soviets to harden their own communication security for their strategic assets, such as the Tu-160 Blackjack bombers and ground-based ICBM launch centers. This made their command communications less susceptible to NATO intercept and jamming than ever before, ensuring operational control during a critical engagement. Washington, preoccupied with the technical meltdown of Sentinel and the political fallout of its massive cost overruns, began to notice the sudden improvement in Soviet military capabilities. NATO SIGINT analysts, still operating under the assumption of overwhelming U.S. technological superiority, reported that Soviet military communications were suddenly cleaner, faster, and more difficult to pin down than standard Soviet technology should allow. Anti-submarine warfare (ASW) efforts against Soviet boats became unexpectedly challenging. They were remaining silent and hidden for longer. The Pentagon noticed the sudden, unexplained leap. But they didn't understand why. Not yet. The truth, that America's own multi-billion-dollar failure had funded, trained, and educated its primary adversary, remained sealed in the black box of the doomed Project Sentinel. The full, humiliating scope of the disaster was still hidden, waiting for the inevitable moment when the two competing technological programs would finally intersect. For years, the engineers and project managers of Project Sentinel had lived in a state of institutional denial. Every problem, the overheating, the desynchronization, the dropped data loads, was blamed on component failure, vendor incompetence, or ambitious timelines. The $6 billion was a sunk cost, justified only by the promise of future, absolute dominance. But by 1987, the program had gone on too long without a single operational success. The sheer magnitude of the budget overrun finally triggered an independent review. This was not the usual perfunctory audit. This was a blue-ribbon panel composed of analysts from outside the military-industrial circle, tasked not only with financial accountability but with assessing the program's strategic viability. The key to unlocking the disaster lay in the meticulous, terrifyingly detailed logs maintained by the systems themselves. The Sentinel team had logged every single failure, every desynchronization event, every power surge, every moment a satellite lost its handshake, not as proof of failure, but as data for future debugging. These logs contained the precise timing and digital signature of every accidental broadcast of the FHSS acquisition signal. The unmasking, linking error to exploitation. The audit team, working in isolation, was eventually granted access to two completely separate, highly compartmented intelligence streams: the Sentinel internal error logs and the highly sensitive NATO SIGINT reports compiled from the WhisperNet operation, reports detailing the sudden, unexplainable improvement in Soviet military communications after 1985. The moment the two data sets were cross-referenced, the horrifying truth materialized. The analysts found an almost perfect correlation. The specific, chaotic timing offset of Sentinel's synchronization failure bursts, the signature of its technical collapse, matched the unique modulation sequences the Soviets were suddenly using in their newly improved air defense data links. The probability of this being a coincidence was statistically zero. The Soviets hadn't just guessed how to build FHSS, they had been taught how to build it by watching the system's unique failure state. They had received a continuous, high-fidelity broadcast of the exact technological weaknesses they needed to avoid in their own designs, along with the fundamental algorithms of the U.S. system's digital handshake. The draft of the final audit report landed on the desk of the Secretary of Defense like a silent, nuclear detonation. Its conclusions were veiled in the detached, sanitized language of the national security state, but the message was crystal clear. The final, classified report concluded: hostile intelligence services have gained substantial insight into U.S. high-bandwidth communication structures as a result of system instability and uncontrolled emissions. This penetration represents a strategic compromise of long-term U.S. command and control integrity, providing the adversary with a developmental window estimated at 7 to 10 years of accelerated research and implementation. Translated, America's $6 billion failure had just boosted Soviet electronics by an entire generation. The money spent trying to leap ahead had merely paid the tuition for Moscow's technological education. The panic and the Great Burial. The immediate reaction inside the Pentagon and the White House was not one of accountability, but of existential panic. This was not a policy failure, it was a strategic betrayal of national trust. The problem was that the failure could not be admitted. Shutting the program down openly would force a congressional inquiry, expose the $6 billion loss, and, critically, confirm to the Soviets the exact scale of the intelligence coup they had achieved. It would tell them, yes, you guessed right. Our system failed, and you know how to defeat it. The decision was made at the highest level: the project must be erased. Not merely cancelled, but systematically vanished from all records accessible to the public or even to most of the government. The surgical erasure of budget lines. The funds were not merely cut, they were surgically scrubbed. Classified budget lines disappeared, their allocations secretly distributed into dozens of existing, mundane budget headings like routine naval systems maintenance and personnel training enhancement. There would be no record of the billions spent. The ghost facilities. Facilities, like the specialized testing range in the Mojave Desert and the main satellite control center in Maryland, were quietly decommissioned. Their staff were abruptly reassigned, and the buildings themselves were either dismantled under cover of night or repurposed for unrelated, low-profile tasks, their specialized equipment sold off as surplus under non-disclosure agreements. The data seal. All data tapes containing the critical failure logs, the audit analysis, and the cross-referenced SIGINT reports were transferred to deep storage vault at the National Archives and sealed for a period of 50 years. This wasn't to protect the data, it was to protect the reputations of the men who greenlit the project. Officially, the project never failed. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by smaller, more manageable research efforts. Unofficially, Project Sentinel became the most expensive, devastating technological gift the United States ever gave the Soviet Union, a historical blunder buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic denial. Part 6. The legacy no one talks about, the ghost in the machine. 4 years later, the geopolitical landscape changed forever. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the floodgates of military information opened, allowing Western assessment teams access to previously impenetrable Soviet military labs and bases. US and NATO engineers, expecting to find crude, outdated electronics and copied Western technology from the 1960s, instead discovered something jarringly modern. The initial shock came in a dusty facility outside of Minsk, where a NATO analysis team was inspecting the remains of a strategic bomber command and control prototype. They found circuit boards and software protocols that were eerily familiar, but structurally sound. The design flaws that crippled Sentinel were nowhere to be seen. Signals that looked just a bit too modern. Encryption that resembled US prototypes. Structures that only one nation on Earth had been developing. The engineers quickly recognized the ghost in the machine. They were looking at a system built on the very principles Project Sentinel had tried, and failed, to master. The Soviet engineers hadn't just copied the US, they had learned from the US system's mistakes, taking the theoretical blueprint and skipping the entire, agonizing developmental phase. The unmistakable fingerprints. The evidence of the intelligence transfer was in the details. The acquisition signature. The Soviet FHSS systems used a unique digital pulse sequence to achieve synchronization. This sequence was virtually identical to the pattern that the Sentinel system had emitted during its thermal failure events, a pattern that would never have been invented independently, as it represented a highly specific, flawed, but functional digital handshake. The digital envelope. The structure of the Soviet encryption protocols, specifically the data packet sizes and the initiation sequence of the key exchange, was a mathematical mirror of the encryption envelope revealed by Sentinel's SIGINT leaks. The US system's accidental broadcast of its structural weaknesses had become the foundation of the Soviet system's strength. The realization was a punch to the gut for the American engineers. It confirmed the terrifying conclusions of the 1987 audit that had been so ruthlessly suppressed. The nation that never intended to share had given away its most valuable technological secrets. The lingering cost. Even today, fragments of that accidental transfer still survive in modern Russian military communication frameworks. Why? Because the core principles the Soviet engineers received were fundamentally sound, reliable, and, most importantly, cost-effective. They achieved a modern communications system for a fraction of the price the US spent developing it, and their version was stable. The cost of Project Sentinel was not just the $6 billion, the money was printed and spent. The real, indelible cost was the loss of the technological edge that the US military had sought to guarantee. It leveled the electronic playing field silently and decisively, proving that in the high-stakes technological arms race, hubris and over-ambition were the most dangerous vulnerabilities of all. The ghost of Project Sentinel remains a silent reminder, a cautionary tale that technological superiority can be bought, but it can also be accidentally broadcast and lost. The geopolitical silence achieved by the execution of the Delta Protocol was perfect. The United States had successfully denied its role in Operation Desert Veil and countless other shadow missions. The three stranded men, and all their predecessors who had vanished into the operational void, were officially scrubbed. The lie was preserved, the treaties remained intact, and the Cold War continued without the escalation that a formal acknowledgement of intervention would have provoked. But history is a persistent force, and bureaucracy, for all its ruthless efficiency, is fundamentally based on paper, logs, and memory. The Denial and Deception (D&D) Executive Committee could seal the present, but they could not control the future. As years turned into decades, and as documents moved from active file rooms to archival vaults, the meticulous cover-up began to fray at the edges. The first hint that the official story was a fabrication came not from a whistleblower or a spy, but from the slow, administrative churn of government declassification. As the Cold War ended and the decades-old classification mandates expired, documents began to surface that referenced events and entities that officially did not exist. The paper trail of denial years later, fragments surfaced. One such fragment was a declassified memo referencing abandoned expedition personnel, dated from the precise period immediately following the Desert Veil incident. The memo, released quietly as part of a massive block of unrelated budget documents, offered no names, no locations, and no mission details. It was a cryptic reference from one high-level intelligence directorate to another, discussing a disposition problem and the unacceptable risk of recovery. The term, abandoned expedition personnel, was a clinical, bureaucratic evasion, deliberately chosen to avoid the military term, missing in action, MIA, which would have triggered legal and familial inquiries. It was the only sliver of institutional acknowledgement that the men of Project Orion had existed, and that their fate was a direct administrative decision. The physical evidence of erasure. More chilling than the paper trail was the discovery of physical evidence. In the tumultuous aftermath of the collapse of one of the Soviet-aligned regimes in the mid-1990s, Western forensic teams entered captured military stockpiles and research facilities. Among the confiscated items, uniforms, weapons, and captured gear, they found an anomalous piece of American equipment. A recovered dog tag with a serial number that never belonged to anyone. The dog tag was authentic. U.S. military issue, standard font, standard metal alloy. But when the serial number was run through the newly opened electronic archives, the query returned a blank. The number was supposed to belong to a living soldier, but the record was empty. The reason? The dog tag had belonged to one of the Project Orion men whose service number had been reallocated to a deceased officer in an entirely different branch during the 48-hour purge. The official record showed a new owner. The physical evidence remained linked to the ghost. This piece of metal was concrete proof that the government had not just lost the soldiers, but had actively overridden their identities. The confession in confidence. The final, definitive leak came not through bureaucratic error or physical recovery, but through the weight of a guilty conscience. As senior officers retired, the strictures of institutional loyalty loosened, and the need for historical clarity began to assert itself. One private letter, written by a retired general who had sat on the D&D Executive Committee and was addressed to a trusted, high-level colleague, surfaced years after the author's death. It contained the emotional, unvarnished truth that could never be spoken in public. We cannot allow their return. The risk is unacceptable, not to the mission, but to the entire structure of strategic denial we built. Those brave men became walking time bombs. Their very presence would have been an act of war, forcing a crisis we had spent decades avoiding. Their silence, though terrible, was their last, greatest service to the country. The letter confirmed the cold calculus of the abandonment. It wasn't incompetence that doomed the men, it was the ruthless, absolute priority of national security and the preservation of global stability. The perpetual wall of denial. Despite the fragments, the coded memos, the ghost dog tags, and the retired general's confession, the official position never wavered. Families kept asking questions. Wives grew old waiting for news of reassignment. Parents passed away never knowing where their children were buried. They wrote to Congress, to the Department of Defense, and to the White House. Governments kept giving the same answers. We have no records. We have no information. We have no knowledge of such soldiers. The bureaucratic wall was absolute. The D&D Executive Committee had done its job too well. The institutional lie, created to prevent an international crisis, had become a permanent, agonizing reality for the soldiers' families. But intelligence officers who were there, those who read the classified reports, those who saw the Delta Protocol activated, and those who listened to the final, chilling reply of the synthesized voice, tell a different story. It is a story of soldiers who served their countries in the deepest shadows, executing the most dangerous missions, and who were ultimately sacrificed to the doctrine of deniability. They were the ultimate weapon of the Cold War, used once, and then discarded by the system they swore to protect. They never returned, not because they failed, their missions were successful, their loyalty was absolute, but because they weren't allowed to. They were the greatest asset and the greatest liability, erased from history because the paperwork said they shouldn't exist. They remain the silent ghosts of a secret war, an eternal reminder that sometimes, the hardest order to